with a short introduction to the general topic from my side, but I'll keep it short so we have a lot of time for our experts. And then we have a presentation by Stefan Strohmeyer from the Bocconi University in Vienna. He was previously with the ICARDA Research Institute, and as far as I know, he still has some mandates with them. Stefan is a real soil and surface hydrology expert, and he will introduce us on how to assess ecosystem services and health in space and time. Thank you a lot, Stefan, for joining us today. And then we have a second presentation by Fabio Cresto. He's climate change consultant, currently with Vivamos Mejor Guatemala. And also Samuel Sequeira, he's the program manager landscapes and biodiversity at Vivamos Mejor Guatemala. Also a big thank you to both of you. They will present their agrobioclimatic monitoring system, which essentially aims to structurally integrate climate information into adaptation strategies for rural communities. So I'm really excited to listen to these presentations. But before we start, let's do a quick Menti exercise where I ask you to log in to Menti and tell us what you expect from today's webinar, what you expect to learn, maybe also why you've joined this webinar in a few words, short phrase. So we can maybe also address or really focus then on these answering your questions within the presentations. So quickly go to www.menti.com, type in the code that is shown here, and then you'll be able to answer the questions shown here. I just see apologies in the... We will not be able to have a French translation. I'm apologies for this. So I hope you'll be able to go to Menti and type in the code 37202396. And we have some first answers appearing here. So insights on monitoring nature-based solutions, learn about bioindicators and nature-based solutions, how to measure biodiversity, monitoring biodiversity. So it seems that nature-based solutions, biodiversity, bioindicators really attracted your interest. Great. Thank you a lot for the first answers. And maybe here, I see the large interest in nature-based solutions in general. Last year, we had a webinar with Veronica Ruiz from IUCN, and she gave us an introduction to the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions, which was developed or published in 2020. The Global Standard is a set of principles, criteria, with different indicators, really defining the global framework of nature-based solutions. And I can really suggest you, the recording is available on our platform homepage, so maybe you want to have a quick look at the recording, get a better understanding of climate change, learn about key indicators, about the technologies that are supplied. So yes, thank you everybody for providing these answers and for giving us a better understanding on where your interests are for this webinar of today. Great, and I would suggest we continue on with our presentation. So there's some EcoDRR NBS monitoring tools. Great, so also please let me know after the session whether you have new ideas for maybe upcoming webinars. We're always happy to take these topics up. Exactly. So I see there have been quite a few of you that really wanted to know, well, what are or more about NBS, nature-based solutions, and apologies. And nature-based solutions are essentially protection, management, infrastructure, interventions that address societal challenges like disasters, climate change, food insecurity, water insecurity, that benefit then livelihoods of people and also benefit biodiversity. That's the IUCN definition of nature-based solutions. And as I said, there is the global standard for nature-based solutions with a set of criteria and indicators, for example, that you have to work on a landscape scale, for example, looking at a watershed or a river basin for interventions in comparison to working on isolated solutions. So happy to share with you also more information on that. But today we really want to focus on the monitoring aspects and on the monitoring and evaluation challenges when it comes to nature-based solutions. And there, of course, I assume all of you know manifold as intervention or changes in ecosystems are complex and influenced by multiple drivers, and the many uncertainties related to climate change impacts and the impacts of nature-based solutions make it then really difficult also to have a clear theory of change and to be sure whether we can rely on what we have assumed or not. There are also long time horizons beyond the project cycle to fully observe the environmental adaptation benefits of our interventions. So when we think about restoration activities, tree planting, it likely will take more than the 3 years we have in a project cycle in order that the interventions reach full maturity. And then there is the question of what we really want to measure besides the improved income situation for the household. Do we look at soil health? Do we look at the reduced risk of landslides, runoff? So there's always multiple benefits sectors we can look at, and where do we start really with measuring? Then, of course, there's the feasibility issue, lack of resources or limited resources, accessibility when it comes to remote areas, and then, yeah, really the question how to define smart bioindicators. But in a nutshell, we can say they're imperative in order to have an iterative, adaptive project management, which provide then also scientific evidence on what works in our NBS projects or what may not work. So yeah, the aim of this today's webinar is that the inspiration you gain from the 2 presentations today will really help you answering the questions you might have for your own project. What kind of smart bioindicators can we include? Can we feasibly measure within our project? And how do we do that? This is a picture from Tajikistan. I think we were lucky to have an 8-year project financed by SCC. That's rarely the case. So here we were really able to show the outcomes, the impact the project had within the project life cycle, but usually the timeframes are much shorter. So we were lucky then in this project to have Stefan visiting our project. And with Stefan, we were able to do soil sampling, soil analysis, together with students from the Tajik Agrarian University. And for me, it was quite mind-blowing when we were in this soil lab and we could really see soil from the treatment plot, where you see on the left with the tree plantings and alfalfa plantings, and on the right center, the control plot where we didn't have any interventions. And this soil hydraulic conductivity was 10 times faster in the treatment plot. So it's not directly correlated, well, one-to-one correlated with water holding capacity, but there's a correlation, and maybe then Stefan will correct me. But so this was quite mind-blowing to really see, well, there's not only a socioeconomic impact of our project, but there is a real impact on the runoff in this flood-prone area through our interventions. And so this is also one of the reasons why this really, let's say, revelation to me. I thought we really have to invite Stefan as a soil hydraulic expert to this webinar. And now I would like to hand over to you, and I'll stop sharing my screen and give the floor to Stefan. Thank you, Stefan.
Thanks, Arabella. I mean, I'm awkwardly touched. Thanks for your kind introduction and your kind words. It was a pleasure. It was really nice to meet you that time in Tajikistan. And basically on Friday, this Friday, I will go again and we will continue our work there. So thanks for inviting me, and thanks for giving me the chance to show some examples. This time, not directly about Tajikistan, but generally about assessing ecosystem services and health in space and time from the soil water plant perspective. You introduced me, thanks for that. Just to say, at the moment, I'm at Boku University, Vienna, as you rightly said. Previously, it was at ICARDA and still have some projects going on. And what I show today is for sure a joint work between university, but also mainly ICARDA, where we still continue our work there. Short after I sent you the title, I found out, or we both found out, it's very ambitious to talk about ecosystem services in space and time. So let's say downbreak this a little bit. So we said, let's look on 2 case studies. One case study is in the Middle East, in Jordan. One case study is in East Africa, in Ethiopia. Basically, the Ethiopian case study was exactly the link between university and ICARDA, where I shifted at that time as a postdoc. So it's a project directly at my heart. Both projects have something in common. They have degraded lands, and these degraded lands need to be, let's say, protected for further degradation, so to keep some fertility. But in both cases, they also have some rehabilitation aspect. And in both cases, it has rehabilitation of soil and water aspects, which then boost the vegetation, the biomass, the biodiversity. Basically, to further break it down, what I'm talking today is about this soil-water-plant relationship. If you look at the ecosystem services, there's a huge bunch of ecosystem services, including also cultural, also regulating. Probably I touched the regulating, but basically most people are interested in the support in the provisioning ecosystem services like biomass and yield. So I will focus on biophysical parameters and biophysical aspects, but biophysical aspects closely related to values for the society, not only yield, but also other services. And I hope, and what I think I got from the title that my colleagues, Samuel and I think Fabio will go then further with more on the biodiversity side. So as you said, I will look on soil hydrology, soil physics, and how this can serve the ecosystem as an anchor for biodiversity, for resilience against degradation, and for boosting agricultural yields for the farmer's livelihood. So let's start with assessing ecosystem services and soil health or health in space. For this part, I would like to start with the case study in Ethiopia. Here we have the problem of famines, of land, let's say, land use change, massive land use change of native forests into agriculture for subsistence farming. And these steep sloped areas with bare soils are highly prone to degradation. And there were several attempts from the ministry, from the government, international projects to try to introduce some soil and water conservation interventions. Among most, let's say, successful and widely outskilled are so-called stone bunds. These stone bunds are a measure along the contour line of the terrain. These stone bunds, they should basically retain some water, but basically the soil, depending on the system, depending on the rainfall and soil characteristics, they hold back both water and soil. If rainfall is too strong, too high, if soils are too low infiltrating, for example, heavy clay soils, they mainly hold back sediments. So the question is, what do these stone bunds do on soil, water, and eventually vegetation? And one thing we looked on several things, but time is limited. So one thing we looked at is what happens at the farmer field scale, at the plot level. Usually subsistence farmers in Ethiopia, they don't have more than 1-2 hectares of site by themselves. Basically, it's less than 1 hectare usually. So we talk about areas of, let's say, 50 by 50 meters or something like that. So we looked on what happens to the soil and the water in these areas. One problem is for sure, water is drained too quickly. It doesn't infiltrate in the soil, so it doesn't give the plant then the water requirements for their growth, for the evapotranspiration, but it runs off, and by running off, it also erodes a lot of soil. So we made run-of plot experiments where we collect in well-defined areas the amount of water and soil coming down the hill to a collection area. We made this trial in controlled areas where we didn't have any kind of soil and water conservation interventions, where we didn't have the stone bunds, and we made a trial at the stone bunds to understand hydraulically what works. This experiment was done with the local community. Basically, local community went with us to the field, installed with us the sites, and made the whole monitoring. So all the data I show here is based on local monitoring, rainfall, runoff, soil, based on local communities. And at the end, they also get the feeling about how much soil and how much water they removed from one side and not the other. So they already get an idea about here 5 times, 10 times more, which is a good learning aspect. So for us, scientifically interesting probably is to see how much water were overspilling and how much sediments were overspilling such a stone bund. It doesn't matter the exact number, I just show it here, but it is about having between 60 and 80% conservation retention. So in water, a little bit less. In water, it's between, let's say, around 40 to 20 to 40% reduction. And in sediment yield, sorry, not 80, it's about 20 to 60% reduction. So this is the amount of sediments you keep in the watershed instead of getting it flushed from the fields. The question is then further, okay, the sand or the sediments, the fertile soil stands in the field, but what would happen at large scale? So one question is the farmer's field. The other question is, for example, downstream eutrophication in ecosystems. In our case, it's the Lake Tana basin. So sediments, fertility would go to the lake. The lake would eutrify, and eutrophication would have an impact on fishery. So we want to look on what happens at the integrated watershed scale. There we also went with the people. We made some control points for measurement. Local people went with us, measuring sediment yield, water yield from the watersheds. This was given to a model. We run the model with different inputs. I'm happy to discuss, but for the sake of time, I keep it short. Basically climate, topography, soil, land cover, land management inputs. And what you get then is a spatial response of where erosion, where water losses happen. And then this is like a hotspot map. It gives a basis for decision-making of going to one or the other location first, of having certain area which is of critical problem, of having beyond sustainability, and that's a point which I will do shortly, beyond a certain threshold of soil rebuild rate, for example. Do we have a problem, yes or no? We can find out of this hotspot map related with my next topic I want to show. Basically here in assessing ecosystem services on the water and soil dynamics part, coming from the water, coming from the soil at the field scale, yielding this data, the conservation effects, for example, 20, 30%, 60% retention, you can give the model as a parameter. It's called, for example, a support practice factor. You can directly give it to the model, and the model will tell what happens at the large integrated scale. So this is from the water, from the soil to the landscape scale. But more important probably, and this is what you raised, Arabella, is like we need to have in a nature-based solution this kind of longer time horizon beyond the project. Planting a tree is a good thing. Making a picture of a tree without a tree, yes, it's always impressive, but the question is, do we do something sustainable? There might be a tree growing, it might still degrade. The land might still be not sustaining itself. The soil might still erode. The soil depths might still decline, but let's say slower. So it's good to have a tree, but the question is it sustainable? And that's a question which we try to answer in the Middle East, in Jordan. There we talk about the very dry areas, the heavily degraded areas, overgrazing, mismanagement, mechanized agriculture in areas which don't allow. The question is, do we have water there at all in an area with less than 200 millimeter average annual rainfall? Yes, you see on the right-hand side, there is water, just not at the right place in the right time where it should be. So the idea is to do something better with the water other than threatening the downstream infrastructure, downstream livelihoods. Actually, in an area, in a water-scarce country, Jordan is always listed among the top 10 water-scarce countries, people drown in the desert every year. Typically every year, cellars are flooded in Amman, people drown because of floods. So there's obviously something better to do with it. So we thought about a nature-based solution for ecosystem status change, for keeping some water in the watersheds through micro-water harvesting, boosting the vegetation to come from the degraded somehow back to a resilient ecosystem as it has been before. And in a few slides, I will go into more detail into this, but the idea was to give a change into the spiral, the degradation spiral, and to give nature a chance to heal itself. Basically, we did it based on water harvesting. So the degraded soils, they don't have vegetation, they don't intercept water. There is no surface structure, there is no residues which build microdams and hold back some water. There are no roots, macropores which infiltrate water. Basically, there's degraded soil, a hard crust, and water runs off more quickly as it was in the past. And this is a bad cycle because if water, the rainfall, is not stored in the soil, it also doesn't give a chance for any vegetation to come up. So what we do is we break up this hard crust with micro-water harvesting and try to plant vegetation. And later on, this vegetation will do the job. The micro-water harvesting will degrade over time, but the vegetation will intercept, will create litter, will create macropores, and do the job. The way we did it at that time was with the Valarani Delfino plow, as you see at the left side. It's a mechanized micro-water harvesting. It goes quite quick. You can do around up to 10 hectares a day if the driver is motivated and the conditions fit. So basically it makes this intermittent micro-water harvesting pits where you put a seedling, a shrub, a tree, and the runoff between the space yields into this pit, deep infiltrates and boosts the shrub growth. And this shrub also tends then to encroach and tends then also to create macropores. So later on, it does the cycle of retaining some water and to stabilize the nature as it is. The question is, does it do in a sustainable way or do we just plant shrubs or trees? So we try to monitor this. One fancy way to do this is to monitor, for example, soil moisture. We did this along a transect. We monitored soil moisture every some minutes and looked on what does it do to the water content. We did some statistical analysis without going too much into detail, but it looks like the water, of course, yields into biomass. So the blue water turns into green water and the evapotranspiration of the plant produces then also some more biomass, which is to the benefit of the farmer, of course. But the question is then, besides having this kind of beautiful landscape restored versus degraded, is this land, let's say, sustainable? Is this land, let's say, keeping its conditions over longer time periods, or is it just green? And that was the point where we coupled water and soil monitoring with modeling. So there is success, but is it sustainable? That was the key question and sustainability was defined over time. Will it hold for longer than just some years? Where will it lead to? What is the water and soil dynamics we have to expect in the future? The way we tackled it is that we set up some scenarios. So we again used a model, which is biophysically very sound. So it looks on cover soil conditions. Basically, you need to give it high temporal resolution rainfall. And we developed some scenarios as baseline, degraded, restored, which means the degraded scenario is as it is now in Jordan. The area is degraded, which means nearly zero vegetation cover, hard crust soil, compacted layers, stone content on the surface. The restored, we have some ideas because of our restoration sites where it goes. There are also some reserves which were not touched in Jordan, let's say protected sites. We went and had a look. And the baseline, we also did a quite interesting approach with local communities that we asked older people of the local communities how it was in the past and the way we did it, because they will not give us surface cover by shrubs and annuals and so on. So we asked them, in the past, with your sheep, how far could you go with the sheep? How far were the sheep away that you couldn't see them anymore? And then they said, yeah, from here to there, 50 meters, something like that. And then we made a structure, how dense the shrubs need to be that this occurs. So we tried to play a little bit with narratives of the people to create our scenarios. We went to desert castles, hunting lodges, looked on paintings, what kind of animals lived there, what these animals were typically eating or grazing. So we had an idea about what kind of shrubs were there, what kind of density we got from the people. We developed these scenarios. And these scenarios, again, gave us an indication about surface runoff, erosion. I showed these two parameters. It gives a lot of more, but I want to focus a little bit on these two. So it shows that in the baseline, it seems like runoff was around, let's say, 17 millimeter per year, between 15 and 20. In the degraded case, it increased to around 25. It doesn't seem very much, but relatively speaking, you talk about an increase of 1/3, 30% higher runoff, which is a lot in an area with little rainfall. And it showed that our restored scenario somehow comes to this order of magnitude down, which means we would keep this amount of water as it has been in the past, which would justify and say, yes, you local communities in these rural areas can keep some water as it was in the past. Don't hold everything back, but this amount is fine. And it's related with a certain erosion pattern, which seems also sustainable. The right-hand graph is a little bit more complex to read. It means the occurrence probability of erosive events. In the baseline, without going too much into detail, but in the baseline, you see, for example, the green part, the green part with 0.5 means in a point of now, the occurrence probability of this event is 0.5, which means statistically it comes every second year. And this is related with a certain erosion amount. The event which comes every second year comes also in their restored scenario around every second year, a little bit less. But more important are the extreme events. 0.05, the red one, means the extreme event coming every 20 years. And this extreme event in the degraded case would come with a probability of 0.6, which means it comes more than every second year. So this extreme erosion event, which usually comes every 20 years, comes every second year, which means it cannot be in the same pattern of the past. But now in the restored, it goes close to this. It is at least in the same order of magnitude, which tells us that the soil and water dynamics, which are the anchor for the plants, the biodiversity, are in a pattern as it has been in the past. And in the past, the land was sustainable for thousands of years. Bedouin were grazing, circling around, so the land was continuously looking as it looked. And if we achieve soil and water dynamics as they were in the past, we can consider that the system is in equilibrium with its soil rebuild rate. So this was for us the check, yes, the system is sustainable, but, and that might be probably more the part of my colleagues than later on, for example, Samuel and Fabio, it does not mean that same plants will come. Probably some seeds are gone forever. It might be a different ecosystem. It might be still provisioning livelihoods. It might be still sustainable, but it's something different. Probably some seeds, black iris, is gone forever. We don't know. But anyways, from a biophysical point of view, soil and water, for us, it's an interesting indicator. Yes, what we do seems to have a basis of, it's not only greener, it also holds over time. My last point was, okay, we have a certain watershed, and as Ravella also said in the introduction, it's not only about making a plot, and the plot gives you examples, it's about what would happen at scale. Is it worth it? Is there a lot of suitable sites where you can do a certain thing? So what is the potential scale or the potential at scale? So what we did is, if we talk about water harvesting-based solution, we made a suitability assessment. And the suitability assessment basically had two steps. One step is general land suitability, which means it needs to be bare land. We will not restore a forest. It needs to have certain soil depths. If we plow with the mower plow, we need to have at least 40 centimeters, otherwise we destroy the plow. We cannot make it too steep because otherwise the tractor would tip. Too much stones would have a problem for the plow itself, it would destroy. Too sandy soils are a problem because the water harvesting pit doesn't hold and water infiltration goes too quick, there is no runoff. Too clayey soils might be vertisoils, make macro cracks, water just flows through. So we have certain thresholds of, is the land suitable, yes or no? And the second layer is the more interesting layer. Is there runoff to harvest in a certain time, which is interesting for us? And this runoff hydrological criteria we made with the global model. And there again, in our areas where we work, these areas are very data scarce, and I think we all face the same problem. So there is not so much stream gauges to ask and check the data. What we did is, we again went to local communities and asked them, how many times this area is flooded per year? And different age groups gave us different results, but basically, in this example, they told us around 5 to 10 times a year, maybe 7 times a year, this area is flooded. So this, you have runoff, you can harvest. Our model showed something quite similar. Like a certain runoff event with a certain threshold goes in the direction people told us. So we set up the model based on that, and then we applied the model. So the model in turn gave us out a map of where we have potentially runoff and soil conditions where we could apply this kind of system in a good, medium, or no performance, and to have an idea about potential scalability. With this kind of map, we can start to discuss and balance what would it mean at large scale. Having a watershed restored, having a community happy is one thing, it's a very important thing. But the other thing is, like for a country or for a fund, for a project to invest, is the question about what the project gains, how many people, how many million hectares, how many cubic meters would benefit of this technology. So the question is not only on-site, but also off-site. And for this, I also want to show very, very quick, in the last minutes I want to talk here, it's not only benefiting the ecosystem services on-site, the local communities on-site, it has also values for the off-site. And talking about indicators, yes, it might not be the most easy indicator, but it's a value, and a value which probably is worth to discuss at one point. And since we go a little bit more the scientific way, we try to understand how would such restoration or rehabilitation of degraded lands benefit a certain aspect, in this case, sand and dust storms development. So the question is, would this restoration of the very remote areas not only benefit the on-site characteristics, benefit the rural Bedouin tribal farmers, but also benefit the downstream city, let's say Amman or whatever, from not having these sand and dust storms, which cause huge damages on infrastructure. They cause huge damages also on health, respiratory apparatus, and so on. So basically, it reduces work, labor. It's a big economic issue in the Middle East, in other countries in North Africa as well. So what we did is we again feed a biophysical model. We looked on certain cover characteristics. We worked with the local community together. In this case, quite funny, we went with local communities and held some bed sheets and made some pictures to see the kind of density of the shrubs, which was direct input to our models. And we coupled the model. So we made a small plot scale model, and we coupled this model with an atmospheric model. And in the end, you see here Jordan, for example, you see Jordan and you see what this kind of shrubs would do to a certain dust storm and the potential change. In this case, you see on the upper right figure, you would see the dust in microgram per cubic meter, the relative change in values, and the absolute change and the relative change in percentage, like we would reduce in some areas up to 100% of the dust, in some areas between, let's say, 0 and 50%. And based on this single event or longer event runs, we can see the value of how much we would reduce dust particles in the cities, in the areas where they affect infrastructure or labor. And basically, we also made a project about this concept in Lake Aral area, and we coupled it with numbers, with dollars, how much money you would actually lose not doing nature-based solutions and not trying to prevent degradation. So there are two factors. One is really land degradation on site, loss of livelihoods, loss of water, soil, biodiversity, and the decline of livelihoods on site. But also quite interesting, probably a little bit more tricky, is this off-site part, which is not always trivial to give a value, but it has a value. And that's something I wanted to show. Probably not very conclusive on exactly do this, do that, but giving an idea about what is possible and in which direction also some support materials can be created for decision support. I will stop here. I think I took my 24 minutes now, and I just want to say thank you, and thanks Arabella again. And yeah, happy for some short discussion or whatever you prefer if you want to continue with further presentations. So thanks a lot, and over to you, Arabella.
For this very dense, concise, very informative presentation. I'm sure there are a lot of questions from our participants, or maybe they just have to process all this information a bit, but the floor is now open for everybody to ask your questions. You can directly unmute yourself or type the question into the chat box. In any case, otherwise I would start. So probably some of us are now asking, wow, this sounds really great. And it would be great if our project could inform by scale. But maybe that's a bit overambitious for the size of our project. So what would you say for smaller projects, the resources that are required to go to the field, to have these, do these runoff assessments with the communities and so on? Can you maybe tell us a bit how, for smaller project, this might be a feasible approach, and what kind of partners we would likely need to do all these assessments?
Yeah, thanks, Arabella. It's a good question, because yes, I realized it might be a little bit beyond the typical scope of a restoration or a nature-based solution-oriented project. But it showed what is potentially doable. But in all these projects, since these dry areas, or in general remote areas, are data scarce, you need to work with the communities anyways. So these are the best sources of data to start with for anything. If you do it fancy or less fancy, in both cases you need. For a small project, what I would do is basically the first thing is that people continuously go to the site and just have a look, take a picture with a mobile phone, for example, surface cover. You just go surface cover every week, you see, and there are easy softwares which can directly compute surface cover leaf area index. How does the surface, is it start to be protected over the rainy season? This is one thing. The second thing is to take some soil samples. They don't need to be fancy as we did it with core cylinders, just disturbed soil samples. You can see a lot of things in the structure, very easy tests, hand tests of soil, aggregate stability. This kind of things can be done very easily. Also, just looking in the soil profiles, you see a lot of things. And then another thing is what we start now also in Tajikistan to go one step more fancy, I would say, to make some permanent, easy permanent observation stations. As we do, for example, erosion plots, we do it also in Tajikistan. It's very important to work with local community and probably a local university together. So there's a master thesis trying to make sense out of the data collected. Or less fancy, you can easily just put, for example, erosion pins and look on that. Again, pictures. So the most important thing I would say is getting local communities out to the field in a kind of continuous monitoring approach, taking pictures with some marks in the environment and seeing the change themselves. And if you do it a little bit more fancy, runoff plots or weirs or whatever, if you collect the sample, just put it on the site. Local people come, have a look, they see directly, okay, here I have to carry 5 bags of soil versus here 1, it loses 5 times more soil. Whatever the absolute number, you see just the relative behavior, and that's already quite an eye-opener. And in our case, I don't want to take too much time. The local communities were basically sometimes very protective. So when we said, please make a grazing experiment here or there, they started to say, but you know, the recruitment just came, my sheep will just destroy this. So people start to engage with the site and see the value and even warn you ahead of doing things. So I think important is really to have this local community university fit, that you have a motivated student going a little bit beyond, but you have local communities going there in a continuous manner and seeing with their own eyes, and then sure give feedback from the results. Something like that, I think, always worked very fine to my personal opinion, but I'm happy to also hear from Samuel and Fabio what kind of experience they have in this aspect.
Thanks a lot, Stefan. And I'm getting lots of ideas what kind of guidance we could produce within the activity line. So much appreciated. There are some more questions. So first one by Fabio, quite technical on the erosion model. Maybe, and then it's a question by Thomas, whether you could provide a list of core activities that need to be considered to implement such a project. And then maybe I let you answer these 2 questions first.
Yes, thanks. Yes, I mean, it's a good point. I see Russell, he goes in the direction. So basically what we used is USL, the modified USLE in SWOT, the soil and water assessment tool. So it's a biophysical model having this insight for the large scale. The small scale was done with, in our case, RAM. It's the rangeland hydrology and erosion model. It's the sister of the water erosion prediction project. So it's the event-based model. So small scale Hillslope event-based model, large scale daily, something like Russell, but yes, sounds like you already did something in that direction. A list of core activities that need to be considered in such a project. It is very important to first have, to my opinion, a mapping of the problem of the hotspots and the representativity of a question. Like it's not going somewhere where you know the people, it's going somewhere which represents the problem. And this is what we did also in our case. In our case, for example, in Jordan, it was degraded rangelands. And so we need to define what are rangelands, what is the rainfall range, what kind of land covers we have to see something very representative for large areas. Also having for sure a community which is able to work with you. In our case, we did it probably a little bit the wrong way, but it would be good to first go to the community and ask them, would you do this for that? Because one core part of what this project delivers is community-based management. If you do something like trying to restore degraded areas, it's about some are losers, some are winners. So it's not about enhancing a single field productivity, but enhancing a watershed. So it needs first really talking to the communities. Are you able to work as a collective to harvest the benefits also collectively? Because some might win, some might lose. So these are very important indicators, having it representative, having the community willing, and having a chance to see the change, which means you need to have a baseline before you start, and then to monitor the change continuously. I mean, I'm happy to provide probably a little bit more information, but generically I would say like this. The last comment, I understand it was a little bit techy. I faced this myself, so I'm sorry for that. But indicators, in our case, in this case, I cut it down from some parts, but basically if you look on, for example, SDG 15, life on land, and look on the land degradation neutrality target, it's 15.3.1, I think. There, the main indicators are land cover, land productivity, and carbon. So land cover is easy to monitor probably on the site with pictures, but also satellite-based NDVI can go for biomass, some field experiments, and carbon, because carbon is very related to soil erosion. So basically these 3 indicators I tried to tackle indirectly. So land cover was the driver of our models. Biomass was then the output we measured, and carbon is related to sediments in this way. And water basically drives the whole thing. So what we looked in this case was the drivers for the indicators, which are the main dominant indicators for land degradation neutrality. But I agree with you. There's a bunch of soil physical, soil chemical, soil biological indicators, just looking at the soil, where you have this kind of soil hydraulic conductivity, soil depth, spark density, all these kind of things. There are some typical suspect indicators available. I mean, I'm happy to also share something on that. But what we try to do overall is trying to feed into proving land degradation neutrality and going for these kind of indicators. I showed it a little bit scientific, I showed it a little bit indirect, but eventually it goes in this direction. I think I used my time more than, so I don't want to stress.
We have 2-3 more minutes, I would say. Sophie's asking whether you value the benefits derived from restored ecosystem services, notably to compensate the contributing communities via payments for ecosystem services. CES, I don't know, is that something related to carbon? Not sure.
I don't know, Sophie might tell us what is PES and CES. I mean,
PES is a payment for ecosystem services, and CS is compensation for ecosystem service. Basically saying that you can compensate the communities not only through payment, but through any other in-kind form. Building a school or helping the communities with their priority needs to compensate their work on restoring ecosystem services.
Very good point. Well, yes, in our case, it is in the restoration, it's a little bit unpleasant part is that rehabilitation needs time. So the first 1-2 years are not really a benefit of the community. So there you need just the trust. You sometimes overstress the trust already, but now people are starting to get very protective and they see the benefits. So basically also during Corona, where the market was closed, people could not commute, buy fodder for their livestock. They saw the value of having this kind of resilient reserve where they can tap into, even if it's not sustainable. So yes, people see the benefit. What we do is, we exactly did this. The valuation of ecosystem services in biomass is very easy, but also carbon. For example, we ran a carbon model. I didn't show it because it's too much, but we showed the add-on in carbon and gave it a number between, typically I think between $30 and $150 per ton, I think something like this. How much carbon and how much money you would probably get back because of carbon credits doing this kind of restoration. And also what we did is a lot of asking the communities, because one thing is to have these numbers ready, the decision maker likes it, but people don't see it. So we did a question to the communities. It's not the kind of the price, what you need to pay to do a certain thing. It's about the willingness to forgo. We made a test about what does it need that someone would refrain to tap into unsustainably. Yeah. This kind of things, yes, I mean, I'm not a social economist, but these things were looked at. I mean, I would be happy to connect you with some colleagues and if this is something which is of your interest, but yes, very good question, very, very important for sure.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Stefan.
Thank you.
Great. I see there is a hand by Samuel. I think we should now continue on to your presentation, Samuel and Fabio, and maybe we can answer the question then later on or in the discussion in the end. So how we came to the second or the topic of the second presentation, last year, I remember that Joachim Jung, who unfortunately cannot be with us today, mentioned in a DR platform meeting that they are currently developing some form of biodiversity monitoring system. And I think all of us were really interested in what that means and in where Vivaos Mejor Switzerland and Guatemala is going with that. So we invited our colleagues Fabio and Samuel to present this their agrobioclimatic monitoring system, which really seems to be like a holistic approach to integrate climate information, biodiversity information into their project monitoring system. So over to you, Samuel and Fabio.
Thank you, Abela.
Thank you.
So welcome to our talk. Today we are going to talk about our proposal for bioclimatic monitoring. It is a proposal that we wrote together with Vivamos Mejor Guatemala and FUPNAPIP, which is the Fundación Parque Nacional Pico Bonito, which is a national park in Honduras. This project is carried on, therefore, in two national parks, in two protected areas, one in Guatemala and one in Honduras. I'm Fabio Castellana. I'm a climatologist by training, and since 2020, I live here in Guatemala, and I'm working now with Vivamos Mejor Guatemala. I'm going to give the first part of the talk and then give the more biological part to Samuel in the second part. Next, Samuel. Thank you. So, just to give a brief context, Central and South America are highly exposed, vulnerable, and strongly impacted region by climate change. This is a section from the last IPCC report. Just to give you a brief context, Guatemala, which is one of the two countries that are involved in the study, in 2021 was responsible for only 0.08% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and Honduras even less, but nevertheless, they are highly impacted regions, highly impacted nations by the consequences of temperature increase, precipitation changes, increasing frequency and violence of extreme weather events, such as hurricanes, dry spells, inundation, and so on and so forth. And on the coastal zone, of course, sea level rise. So the idea of this project is to focus not in climate change mitigation, because the greenhouse gas emissions are already quite low here, but really on the adaptation. So to increase the resilience of population and ecosystems in front of climate change. The next one. Thank you. All this happens in a context with the capacity, that the adaptive capacity of the population is already pretty low. This study from 2017 shows the adaptive capacity of smallholder farmers in Guatemala and Honduras. And well, the colors basically give us an idea of where are the regions where the adaptive capacity is really, really low, and where it's a bit lower, which is the blue regions. In general, though, because of socioeconomic issues here in the region, smallholder farmers don't have the means to adapt to a changing climate. They're based, so their livelihood is based on small-scale agriculture, which is by definition quite vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The next one. Here you see where the project is based. It is based, as I said, in two protected areas, one in Guatemala, which is the Rumcla. It is around the basin of the Lake Atitlan. And in Honduras is the National Park Pico Bonito, which is just inland from the city of La Ceiba. Both areas have a really diverse and heterogeneous topography. In one case, we have various volcanoes around the basin of the lake, and in the other case, we have really a mountain and the slopes toward the sea. So it is they are really complex regions with, they're really diverse also from the cultural and also ecological point of view. So it is really challenging to find adaptive adaptation practices that work for both regions. The next one. So why did we start thinking about it? Well, some key crops and ecosystems are definitely threatened by to be displaced because of the consequences of climate change. What you see here in this picture is from a pivotal study from the Souza and colleagues that basically showed the potential impact of climate change, and in particular, the increase of temperature on one of the most important commercial crops in the region, which is coffee. In this study, they show that areas that are right now cultivated with coffee may not be suitable to be cultivated with coffee in 2050. So how can we adapt to something like that? And how can we communicate to the people the need for adaptation? And can we find also some long-term solution that doesn't only look at what's going to happen next year, but maybe at what's going to happen in 10, 20, 50 years? An idea from the study was, for example, to swap coffee for cacao, or to use different trees in association with coffee that don't compete with coffee, for example, for water. That were some ideas, but this study, as you see, is at a regional scale. So we wanted to really focus on a local scale, trying to work with local farmers and local ecosystems, trying to find tailor-made solutions for the heterogeneous environment that we are working in. Next slide. Thank you. The objective of our agrobioclimatic monitoring, or ABC for short, is that we want to use climate projections at a long or medium or long term to understand the impacts of climate change on agriculture and an ecosystem. The Asociación Vivamos Mejor in Guatemala and FUPNAPIP, the NGO that we work with in Honduras, are playing a key role in connecting the information, the knowledge that we are building up with local community, also to understand their feedback from what is possible for them and what is sustainable to do. The monitoring system will look at long-term potential solutions to climate change impact, both to small-scale agriculture and to local ecosystems. Next. To do that, of course, we need climate information. The issue is that climate change information for models come at a really large scale. Global models generally work at scale of 30 or 40 kilometers. So we need to do this process of downscale climate information at a really much more feasible scale for really representing the heterogeneity of the environment. Sorry for my voice. But so this is one of the first things that we are doing right now, is like trying to see what are the models predicting, and trying to downscale this information at the local level. Next slide. So here are just two examples, two examples from the region that we are working with. On the left side, you have the National Park Pico Bonito, and on the right side, you have the basin of the Lake Atitlan in Guatemala. These are the climatologists downscaled at 1 kilometer scale for the two regions for precipitation. So how the precipitation in average looked like in the past 30 years. This is the first step that we need to understand to have a baseline for the climate in the two regions. In both regions, we see, as I suggested before, a wide heterogeneity, not only in the landscape, but really in the precipitation. So you have drier region, wetter region, and therefore you can imagine that the agriculture is really different already right now, and is adapted to this climate. But the climate will change differently from the drier to the wetter region, and therefore we really need to find and to apply tailor-made solutions for the different parts of the two areas. Basically, we cannot have one solution that fits them all, but we have to find solutions which are more sustainable and more efficient for the different regions. Next slide, please. Large-scale data sets are not the only ones that we are using to build up the climatology. We are also using insight to observation. Both NGOs have been working in the past with local communities, and they have pluviometers, community-based pluviometers that we are potentially using in the future also to train the global model for the downscaling process. What you see here on the first figure, for example, is the combination of all these pluviometers and the climatology over the past 30 years from the local weather station from the Weather Institute of Guatemala. And so we are using basically a combination of community-based information, large-scale data sets, weather information from official sources. This bimodal shape that you see is basically the typical climatology of the basin of Lake Atitlan. This is the precipitation. You see that we have a well-defined rainy season between May and October, but you have two peaks in June and in September, October, and it is really, really important, the position of these two peaks of precipitation for the farmers. And also we have to monitor how these two peaks they will change, if they will change in the future, if we want to give good information for climate change adaptation to the farmers. Next slide, please. Samuel is going to talk in a second about bioclimatic monitoring, but a big part of our project is focused on agriculture. We have right now 4 people who are analyzing the current baseline for 4 major crops in Guatemala and in Honduras. In Guatemala, we picked coffee and corn, which are covering 15% and 17% of the territory respectively. What you see here in the picture is the land cover of corn, which is a super important crop for the people culturally, but also for their nutrition. And of course, and coffee is the most important commercial crop in the region. So we want to understand what is the impact of climate change on these crops in a different region to give, to increase the resilience of the small scale farmer. In Honduras, we chose cacao and rambutan, which are, again, in this case, both commercial crops, but are extremely important for the economy of the local communities that live within the national park. Next slide. Thank you. So what we have to do now, we have to downscale climate information for the future. What you see here is a projection for 2050 in a moderate emission scenario for the future of the precipitation in the basin of Lake Atitlan. We want to use a combination of already available downscale climatology in 3 future scenarios, a moderate, an optimistic, and a really pessimistic one. And we also want to combine this information with an analysis of extreme weather events. As also Stefan was saying before, extreme events are extremely important for understanding for the impact not only on agriculture, but only on ecosystems. So even if in average the temperature or the precipitation will change in a direction, we have to look at extremes to really focus on the impact of what's going to happen in the future. So we are right now in the phase of evaluating which kind of model we want to use. We are right now tending on the use on using not a multimodal mean for the future, but just one model, but it's quite technical and I'm happy to talk about in the, if you have question about it. The idea is that we want to cross-examine the information for the future with the baseline that we are building right now for the biological part and the agricultural part to identify the major threats to selected crops and to key ecosystem indicators. Next slide. Thank you. The idea is that we want to elaborate science-based potential solution to long-term climate change impact. We aim to take into account also the feedback from the local communities, and we want to organize participatory workshops and establish in the communities monitoring plots on a longer term to really understand on a local scale, even with local data, the potential impact of climate change on the local agricultural practices. The potential solutions are aimed always, and that's really our goal, to reduce the vulnerability of the communities, taking into account their sustainable development and needs. And also because my voice is at the end, I give the microphone to Samuel for the next part.
Thank you, Fabio. So as Fabio was saying, well, the main idea is to design a methodology based on bioindicators to monitor the impact of climate change on ecosystems and their services in two protected areas of Central America and Guatemala and in Honduras. I'd say that the keywords here are bioindicators, which is a big challenge to pick those bioindicators, climate change, ecosystem, and services. I really think it's worth mentioning that we're still in progress. We're still working on it. And what I'm going to present right now are just some main ideas and thoughts of how we think we can approach all this methodology. But we welcome all comments and suggestions. So we're still constructing this idea. On the right, this is a photograph taken by a drone. It's a cloud forest in Lake Atitlan. You can see the lake behind, which is one of the protected areas where we're working. So a little bit of the conceptual framework. So we all know the importance of biodiversity for human well-being, but I think it is very important to understand and describe how really biodiversity contributes to human well-being. And we know that through ecosystem services, we achieve human well-being, and there's a link, a real clear link between biodiversity and ecosystem services. But also it is very important to describe this link. So we say that each ecosystem services is supported by an ecological function or an ecological ecological process. And for that ecological process and function to happen, there's a set of species or ecosystems that provide that ecological process. So human well-being is achieved through ecosystem services, and behind each ecosystem services, there's an ecological function, and behind each ecological function, there's a set of species that contributes to that process. So we all know that we can describe biodiversity and we can measure it and describe it in different levels, genes, species, and ecosystems. And in this methodology, we're taking into account species and ecosystems. Also ecosystem services, like Stefan was saying, there are different ecosystem services, but nowadays we call them nature's contributions to people, to make it a more accessible language for politicians and for everyone overall. But it is very important, I think, that we can group these ecosystem services into two main categories. The ones that are tangible, for example, firewood, timber, etc., and those that are a bit more intangible, that we can't really look at them, but are there. And the way we can link biodiversity and ecosystem services is through functional diversity. And functional diversity is based on functional traits. So basically characteristics of some species that are needed for the ecosystem service to happen. For example, a tree, here we have different species of oak trees, and we know that certain species have really deep roots, and these are very important for the soil erosion control, but also for water infiltration, water recharge. So we really need to understand those functional traits in order to understand these functional groups of species that provide and support these ecosystem services for human well-being. So we have designed like four main steps for the methodology in order to create this methodology, in order to pick those bioindicators for the communities to be able to monitor those bioindicators and to see how the impact, to understand the impact of climate change and how fast it will be and how this will affect their ecosystem services. So the first thing is that we want to map in a more accurate way the current forest cover and ecosystems of the two protected areas. We're going to do this through supervised classification of satellite images. Some software we're going to be using GIS, ArcMap, and we're going to be we need some field data collection. And so basically to have a map, the expected result is to have an ecosystem map that is more accurate, that we understand where ecosystems are, how much forest cover we have, but in a more detailed way. And then the second idea is actually to describe the main contributions of nature to people. So the ecosystem services for each ecosystem. So this will be more like qualitative methodology. We're going to be working through, we're going to do some interviews and surveys to key stakeholders around the Lake Atitlan, for example, municipalities, communities, leaders, everyone overall. And we're going to be using a tool for data collection, Covo Collect. And I think it will be very important. We want to understand the perception of people of the ecosystem services that are being provided for them. But we have to really take into account that there will be bias, that people will talk more about the tangible ones than the intangible ones. So, and in the end, we want to have the expected result for this step is to have basically a list of main ecosystem services for each ecosystem. So first we map the forest cover. We want to know the ecosystem distribution, and then we want to know which ecosystem services for each ecosystem. Then we want to define those functional groups of species that maintain vital ecological process and major ecosystem services. So basically, we want to do some plant and bird survey in different ecosystems, like for example, using counting points, vegetation plots, but also doing a literature review of functional traits. So basically, we understand that there is certain ecosystem service for this ecosystem that is providing human well-being for this community. So we understand what species are behind that ecosystem service, what ecological processes are needed for that species, for that ecosystem service to happen. So we're going to be a lot of in the field as well, understanding that the different the richness of species, diversity of species for each ecosystems. And then the expected result is to have, again, a list of species for different ecosystems or patches of forest that allow these ecological processes to happen and to maintain ecosystem services. For example, on the right, you can see this tree, which is canoch, which is a species called Ocotea salvini, which is high quality timber of a cloud forest. But this species needs a bird for the disperser, for the seed disperser of the tree. So the horned one is it's a bird which is endemic, which is endangered. So we know that there is an ecological link between these two species. There is an ecological process happening that allows the population of canoch to be there. So we know that. And then the fourth step is to actually, now, once we understand, we know all the species that allow some really important ecological process to happen that maintains certain ecosystem services, we want to use all the information, the downscaling that Fabio is doing for the climatic variables, and we want to model the present and future ecological needs of these species, of these functional groups and the forest cover. For this, we're going to be using some softwares, Maxent, Circuscape, and the downscale climatic information that Fabio is giving us. So we want to understand, so where the species is right now and where the species will be in the future, or if the population will decrease or will increase, and then the shifts in species and the landscape. And so we're expecting some maps of present and future presence of functional species, so ecosystem service. So the main idea is, first we want to understand in a more accurate way where the forests are, ecosystems are. We want to understand and describe what ecosystem services are they providing for people. We want to understand the ecological processes that support these ecosystem services and what species are in that ecological process. And then we want to model where the species are right now and where will they be in the future. And so, for example, food cooking, a lot of in the highlands of Guatemala, the indigenous communities still use firewood for cooking their meals, their daily meals. So they need a firewood. So that would be a supply service ecosystem that is derived from a species, right? Some species are designed for firewood, and we know that in order for the species to happen in the ecosystem, we need, for example, a bird to disperse the seed. So if communities do a biological monitoring of this bird, which will be our bioindicator, this would mean that the tree population is still there. And if the tree population is still there, it still provide with ecosystem service, in this case firewood, and people will still be able to have firewood to cook their meal. This is a really simple graph and idea, but for example, this is a bit of the landscape here in Lake Atitlan in Guatemala. And so we could say, by describing the population of this bird, which is needed to disperse the seeds of the population of canoch, for example, or another timber or whatever, and we will model where the species is. So we would infer where the ecosystem service is happening, and through the downscale and modeling, we can see like what's going to happen to the species. Will it migrate? Will the population diminish? Will the population increase? So we could infer that ecosystem services will be changing and shifting in the landscape or diminishing. So if people, if communities and leaders and community can like monitor yearly those species, they could infer how ecosystem services will be changing in time, if the ecosystem service will diminish or it will increase, or and this would give the information to communities to be able to adapt in a better way. So if we're losing some key species that are needed to regulate water, and you see that the species are migrating or the population is diminishing, they can expect a diminish of the ecosystem services that is providing water, for example, timber or firewood or all the other ecosystem services that they are. So that's basically the main idea for the biological part. As I said in the beginning, we're still working on it. So comments are welcome. We're going to have several workshops at a national and at an international level to validate these ideas and to validate this methodology. So it's not written in stone. So that's the idea. But we want to empower communities to be able to understand their ecosystems and what ecological processes are happening in order to have those ecosystem services that they benefit from. So that's for my part. I hope we did the time well. If you have any questions, please let us know. I'm going to stop sharing it right now.
Fabio, again, a very rich and very insightful presentation. Again, now the floor is open to our participants. We have about 10 minutes left for your questions, and Samuel and Fabio will be happy to answer them. I just have to quickly open the chat function again. So then I'll start with a short question. So I guess one challenge will be introducing these communities to assessing climatic information, making their own measurements is one side. Then translating this information, analyzing the information so that it's used as an economic decision support is something else. So what is your approach there? How do you make this gap or go to this next step?
Thank you for the question. It's really, really important. So the good thing is that the two organizations have been working for years with the communities, really improving their understanding on weather and climate. So we already have a base on which we can build on, especially for the communication. The challenge, as you said, is really to distinguish between weather and climate, and that the decision that we make right now for what's going to happen in 10 years are not the same one that we have to make for next year. And therefore, it's really a privilege to work with these two organizations that have such a deep roots within the communities, and that they have already channels to communicate with them. And therefore, we want to really start with capacity building workshops as soon as possible, just really to establish this kind of, to transfer this kind of knowledge. The idea is really to work with the community to build this long-term sustainable pilot plots in which you can monitor the change and the impact of climate change over the years, but not only for the next year or the year after that, but really the idea is to have something sustainable for the future.
Thank you a lot, Fabio. Samuel, would you like to add on that?
No, I think Fabio said the main ideas. So we have worked in this particular areas for 33 years. So communities really trust us, and that's the baseline to work all this thing. Maybe one of the challenges that I see is how to like explain people all the intangible services that they are, all the things that they can't really see, because timber is one thing and plywood is one thing because they really depend on it on a daily basis. But like climate regulation, like that kind of ecosystem services that are more intangible, I see a challenge because most of the people don't have, they're communities that are the poor and didn't have the chance for education. And so it becomes a challenge how to explain some things that are a bit technical in a way. So it's always, we have to be very creative on how to approach the idea and how to convince them and for them to understand what's really happening and how to approach it and why it will be important to monitor like bioindicators.
Thank you a lot. I'm sure there are questions. Yes, from Jane. She's saying, birds tend to be the usual go-to bioindicator species for many sound reasons. Have you considered using any indicator species? And if so, what?
So we do want to focus mainly on birds. As you said, they're good indicators because you can see them, they're abundant, also they're pretty attractive, they're kind of easy to identify. But we did, last week actually, we did a field trip around all the ecosystems to start like getting a clearer idea of what we're doing. But we saw that for each ecosystem, we will have to consider different indicators, not just birds, also like plants, not only trees, but also mosses, for example, or epiphytes. So the indicator and the species will vary according to each ecosystems, but birds definitely, we definitely want to use birds, especially because we have a group of young people that we have trained over years to identify birds, and they know all the birds just by sound, actually. So that gives us a huge advantage. Mm-hmm.
If I may add on this point, and this is really an advantage in the Guatemala part, but in Honduras, the issue is that the region is much more remote. So even though it's nearer to a city, there is no clear path to reach even the top of the tallest mountain. It's a 7 days trek, and almost nobody does it. So even to monitor birds in that part is really, really difficult. So we would definitely have to use other bioindicators, as someone was saying. So maybe more on the tree side.
Thank you to both of you. And Thomas comments that the link between functional species and ecosystems, he likes that, and adds that monitoring change in biodiversity is complex. How many lead species do you plan to use as bioindicators?
We don't know yet. That's part of what we will be doing next year. Yes, it is very complex, and yes, we are aware of that, and yes, it is a big challenge, but we want to make it a few species. We want to focus on main ecosystem services for each ecosystem or forest patch, but we want to make it simple. But the risk of making it simple is that we're going to be overlooking a lot of other ecological processes. But yes, the idea is to make it the simpler, the better we feel, but we have to make the right balance of how many species. And a challenge for the future will be how to sustain that, how to, like I said before, how to empower communities and for them to understand that it's very important for them to monitor those species, right? But we want to make it few, but this is something that we're working on.
Great, thank you. And then from Sophie, since species often contribute to several ecosystem service functions and or processes, how do you avoid double accounting when monitoring?
Yes, that's a very good question and a very complex one. This is something, as I said, this is something we're going to be doing next year when we do the plots and the surveys, and once we understand the ecosystem services, and we try to literature and understanding and try not to double count. Yeah, definitely that's something that we have to take into account once we design the methodology. But yeah, perfect question.
Just to give you more of a background. So the project started this year in March, and this year is basically focused more on building up this climate information, the climatology, the baseline, and start with the downscaling of climate change information for the future. So and next year is going to be more focused on the bioclimatic monitoring. Of course, someone started already this year because it's a really, really complex and novel idea. So that's why we started already, but this is going to be the main focus next year. But thank you so much for the questions. I think that we have to take them into account. Really going
to be defining this right now. We have established around 15 points for monitoring in all the different ecosystems. The idea is to have at least 3 points per ecosystem to have some replicates and to have a more clear idea. So it will depend on how many times a year we do it and the costs. There's some points that you have to like walk, so on top of a volcano, for example, and so you have to walk for 4 hours. So there will be some costs regarding to people taking food to stay there, just 1 day or 2 days. We hope that communities and the people who will be monitoring do that because they understand the importance and they wouldn't have to like pay them to do the monitoring. So that's a key aspect. But yeah, we're still defining the cost. We definitely hope to make it lower cost, not too expensive, because otherwise it won't be like sustainable in time. But yeah, again, we have to empower communities and in order for this to work in time.
Thank you, Samuel. And how do you keep, or will you keep, the community youth motivated to do the monitoring? Do you provide them with an incentive?
I think at least in Guatemala, the good thing is that, as I said before, there's a group of young people who are really interested in understanding birds, for example, which will be some indicators. And by heart, they really like monitoring, and that's something they do. But what we have to do is for them to do it in a more systematic way, in a more rigorous way, in order for the data to be more useful. So I think they're already motivated, and we have presented the idea already, and they really like it. The idea is not to give them an incentive, but an idea that I have is linking the private sector with the communities and these young people. For example, there's a whole bunch of hotels that are around the lake, because it's a really touristy area, Lake Atitlan, that are actually aware of the problems, of the environmental problems, of climate change, and they want to contribute and they want to be part of the solutions, but they don't know how. So one of my ideas for making it sustainable is that to link the private sector, like hotels, for example, with the local guides, with the local people who will be doing monitoring. So I think that's a way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh yes, in ecotourism, yes, definitely. They already work in ecotourism.
Great. So we're slowly running out of time. I think we should wrap up now. There's also, and I think we're also through with the questions. So again, from my side, a big thank you to Samuel, Fabio, and Stefan for providing us with these very insightful presentations, and also I'm sure not only for me but for giving us a lot of thought for food on what we can take from that, from what you have experienced in your project, what we could introduce within our own projects, within our organizations. And I will be really happy to continue this discussion on the bioindicators in the framework of our activity line, nature-based solutions. And if anybody joining today is interested as well in keeping this discussion up, please let me know. And then I'm looking forward to our few next webinars. We will have a webinar on climate projections and climate corridors, similar to what we've been discussing also today on September 20. So we're all looking forward to having you join there as well. And then, a big thank you to all the participants for showing up today. I hope it was also insightful for you. And I wish all of you a nice evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. The same.
Bye-bye.